I was kind of telling him a little bit about the things that we've already talked about in class, about the conflict in El Salvador, the basic two sides and a little bit, but I know he's going to give you a little bit more insight into that. And, feel free to raise your hand and ask questions if you want. He's a former professor of mine. I've traveled with him to Guatemala, Mexico, and Spain. So he's been really kind to me. Got me my first job, actually. So, don't be scared. Okay.
What was your first?
No, I shouldn't be scary. I don't look scary.
No, I mean, they should be.
Yeah, okay, all right. So now, are some of you not Spanish students, but are just here because you're interested in what we're going to talk about, or is everybody Spanish students?
Well, actually, I have a class. There's no teacher supposed to bring their whole class, and they're not here yet. So these are all actually my Spanish students.
Yeah. Okay. Well, hey, we'll go ahead and go on. Oh, a little bit about myself. Yeah, Professor Birch, as I know her. I have a hard time with the Saunders, the married name. Yeah, she and I go way back. I arrived at Tarleton 18 years ago for the academic year 1999, 2000. I'm from Corpus Christi, where I was born and raised. Went to school at SMU, and then promptly joined the Navy. This was back in the days when there was a draft going on in Vietnam, and I didn't want to get drafted, so went into the Navy, kind of following my dad's footsteps. He was a naval officer. He was a flight instructor down in Corpus Christi, which is where I'm from, and so I jumped into the Navy. I thought I was going to be a pilot, but I ended up being a frogman and a SEAL instead. And liked it so much, I ended up making a career of it. So I'm a career naval officer and a second career professor of Spanish. I taught Spanish at Tarleton for 17 years. In my teaching at Tarleton, the thing that was most important to me was to do what it would take to develop some fluency for our Spanish students. And clear to me that the way to do that is through total immersion in the language. When I was in the military, and I'll kind of go back to that. I spent my last tour of duty down in Central America, and we found with the military advisors that we were bringing into El Salvador, where I was stationed, their level of Spanish left a little bit to be desired. So what we would do is we would send them to a 24/7 immersion program in Guatemala to really get them up to speed. And I wanted to do that for our students in Tarleton. So we started Spanish immersion in Tarleton, a summer study abroad program, 5 weeks in Guatemala initially, living with families and studying Spanish most of the day, and then out in the community and tours and things and the rest. And was real successful and real eye-opening for a whole lot of students. So we started that in the summer of 2000 and did Guatemala for about 6 or 8 years until things started getting a little bit dicey in the country there. Problems that would put our students at risk. So we branched off into Mexico. Mexico at that time, was pretty safe and secure. But in a couple of years, the narcotraficantes, and the drug lords and all started infiltrating Mexico to a pretty pronounced degree. And our new president, Tarleton, said, well, Professor Smith, I'm going to have to cancel your 2009 program in Mexico because we just feel it's going to be too risky for our students. So we can't cancel Mexico. We picked up Costa Rica and been sending students to Costa Rica for a number of years, and then picked up Spain as well. And as Professor Saunders mentioned, she's gone with me to all 3 of those places. First as a student in Guatemala, then as a faculty assistant in Guatemala, faculty assistant in Mexico, and a faculty assistant and the teacher of 3 of you guys from Stephenville High School in the summer of 2013 in northern Spain and Bilbao. So that's kind of what I've done as far as the teaching career. But I'm here really to talk to you guys more about my experiences and what I learned about Central America in particular, as well as Latin America as a whole, from my military experience. as I alluded to, I went into the underwater demolition teams and then the Navy SEAL teams, and kind of further along in my career, I guess after I'd spent about 15 years in, had a great tour in the Philippines, 3 years in the Philippines, and really got to travel the Western Pacific. I was fortunate enough to get orders to be the commanding officer of a SEAL team, SEAL Team 4, the one that has the responsibility for Latin America, the Western Hemisphere, in the Caribbean. And that was really my baby. Being from South Texas, traveling extensively in Mexico, and feeling real comfortable with the Mexican culture, and having a fair amount of Spanish. That's what I wanted to do. So in the mid '80s, I was at SEAL Team 4 and had the opportunity, to travel through a good part of the Spanish speaking world, particularly where we had interest. Spent lots of time in Puerto Rico, which is really a territory of the United States. We had a major training facility there. A lot of time in Honduras. This was back in the days, when the U.S. was supporting the Contras, to overthrow the government in Nicaragua. So I was down on the border between Honduras and Nicaragua, for a fair amount. But most significantly, at the same time, we were providing military assistance to the government of El Salvador, which was in the midst of a civil war. And my team, SEAL Team 4, provided the Navy advisors, for training up, the Salvadoran Navy SEALs, and their coastal patrol, branch of the Navy. And so that's pretty much what I was doing. I made a lot of trips down to El Salvador to check on my guys there, see how they were doing, and how the program was going. And as I was reaching the end of my tour, I got a call from my officer detailer. Says, "Well, Commander Smith, I've got a job for you that you can't refuse." I said, "Okay, what is this?" Says, I need to send you down to El Salvador. You're the only Spanish-speaking commander that we have in the SEAL teams, and you're it for the job. I said, "Hey, fine. Throw me in that briar patch," because I'd gotten real comfortable in El Salvador. Shoot, that's exactly what I wanted to do. Even took my family with me. Here we are in the middle of a civil war, and I mean it was pretty dicey. And in fact, the position that I was going to is with the U.S. military group assigned to the United States Embassy in San Salvador, the capital. And my job was to be the chief of the Navy section, of the U.S. military assistance on the Navy side. The guy that was in my job a couple of years before was a good friend of mine in the SEAL teams. And he was assassinated down there. He was a single guy, and just wasn't as careful as he should have been, taking the necessary precautions. And one of the things that he did, and his armored vehicle that the air conditioning went out of, he removed the plexiglass armoring around the window so he could get a little bit of circulation. Well, he was a single guy. Went to the Universidad de Centro America there in El Salvador to pick up his girlfriend, who was a student there. And sure enough, the bad guys came on the motorcycle, pulled up next to him with a .45, boom, boom, right in the window. And this is the kind of stuff, that was going on. Since his assassination, the military group really beefed up his security and had it to where all military advisors were accompanied by a bodyguard, a Salvadoran bodyguard, 24/7. And no taking out the windows, of the armored vehicle. And so that's kind of what the scenario was. And so you ask, well, why in the world are you taking your family, your wife, and your 3 young kids, into a place like that? Well, knowing El Salvador and kind of the Latin American culture, very different from what the Mid East is. The culture is, you leave the women and the children alone. They are not to be killed. They're not to be kidnapped. Military advisors, on the other hand, that's a different story. So I thought, well, my wife and my kids would be relatively safe, and said, this would be good experience for my kids. Get a chance, to learn what it's like, living in Central America, in Latin America, going to school there, picking up the language, knowing what it's like, turmoil, with the war going on. And so I did make that decision. This was in 1987. I went a couple of weeks early, to get things set up for the family, to get a house picked out and all, and then bring the family in. So I met him at the airport. My wife got off the plane and said, "What are you doing? Carrying a sidearm with you?" I said, "Well, that's okay. It's just what we do. We go outside the airport. My bodyguard meets us there, and he's got his M16 over his shoulder." And my wife is looking around, going, "I don't know about this." No, it's okay. We're getting into this. Armored Suburban. I'm gonna get on the radio and call and make sure that the coast is clear, that we can safely drive from the airport into the city. In other words, that there's not any roadblocks, that the bad guys have set up. Says, I'm turning around and getting back on the plane and heading back to the States. And no, you can do it. And so she did. Turned out to be fine, during my experience there. And I'm going to get back to the politics in a minute. Just give me a little bit of the personal side, first. But with the real extreme security measures that were necessary to protect the military advisors and all others that were associated with the U.S. Embassy in El Salvador, it had some good points to it. Was able to get a beautiful house that had the required 9-foot fence around it, so people couldn't just come into the yard. I had my permanent house guard at 24/7 with a house guard looking over the wall, with the shotgun, making sure that none of the bad guys were going to try to come. Plus having my personal bodyguard living there with us too, 24/7. But got to live like the rich do in Central America. I mean, beautiful house, with a fountain flowing through the middle of it, a maid's quarters up above the kitchen, for the maids and all, and it was fantastic. We lived on the edge of town, and across the Barranca, the valley from us, the guerrillas held the volcano. El Salvador is full of volcanoes, and it was a couple of miles away. We would sit out in the backyard and watch the Salvadoran Air Force strafing the guerrillas in the volcano and then shooting back, and we could just see the tracers flying back and forth, and that was some pretty good entertainment for us. While I was there, things were really fairly uneventful. I spent a whole lot of time down at the naval base in the Gulf of Fonseca, kind of between Honduras and El Salvador and Nicaragua. My kids went to school at the American school. They'd be picked up by the van in the morning, and of course it was an armored van, and you'd have the guard come out of the van, making sure it was clear for the kids then to slide into the van and go off to the school. They wore uniforms. The school was first rate, quality wise. It was attended, basically by most of the wealthy Salvadorans that could afford to send their kids to a school like that. My kids turned out to be tremendous soccer players. At about the age of 4, they'd have a coach, who was a member of the Salvador national soccer team teaching them. So it's not some person that doesn't know the rules of soccer. It's somebody that can, real expertise, and became real big soccer aficionados after that. Spanish speakers, real comfortable with the culture and the language, and all 3 of my kids to this day have maintained that. My daughter in particular has got a great job. She went to the University of Texas in Austin, and she works for a company that that takes care of caretakers and domestic employees for the wealthy, making sure that these employees are getting the benefits, the taxes are being paid and all. And so she deals with landscapers, and maids and others that call up and say, "Hey, I don't think I'm getting what I should in the way of benefits." And so she acts for care.com with them, but it's turned out real well. Okay, and after my 20 years in the Navy, then time to retire, and teaching is what I decided to do. I got real comfortable with Latin America and with the language side. I want to teach Spanish and teach the culture, and found a job opportunity at Tarleton, and moved up here from Corpus Christi, and been here for 17 years. So that's the not so brief personal experience of what I've done. Now let's get into a little bit about the convoluted political history of Latin America. And talking with Professor Saunders, I know that she's given you guys a pretty good feel for what's gone on. And so I'll kind of pick up from my perspective of it. To me, it really all revolves around World War II, Russia taking over, Cold War coming up, and the spread of communism, and our U.S. government not wanting to see that happen, particularly in our hemisphere. The reality is there had been some unrest prior to World War II, and including even in El Salvador in the 1930s, when there was a communist movement. In Central America, as in much of Latin America, it has been plagued with the situation where you've got the very wealthy who own all the land, have all the riches, and then you have the very poor who don't have anything. We call it, the haves and the have-nots. Typically, the 5% of the population, that owns 80% of all of the land and all of the industry, and then the other 95% that tend to be, very, very poor. The middle class, it has not been strong in Latin America. It's getting stronger now, but it's always been, the rich upper class and the poor, less benefit class. El Salvador was one of those countries. It's been known as having the 10 ruling families in the country that really control the government, own most of the land, had the coffee plantations, the fishing industries and all, and then the rest of the population that had very little. Unlike El Salvador, you have in a number of the Latin American countries a real significant indigenous population. And you see that particularly in Guatemala. Guatemala, even to this day, over half of the population of that country is indigenous, and it's not mixed. It's not like Mexico. Mexico is characterized by the mestizo, the blend of the European, primarily Spanish and the indigenous, and what we have is the stereotypical Mexican that's got a combination of the two, and we call it the mestizo. Guatemala, on the other hand, the indigenous races remain pure. They did not blend in with the conquistadores or the missionaries or anybody else, and so you have Mayans that their blood is 100% pure Mayan. Interesting, in Guatemala, there's about 20 different groups of indigenous, basically Mayan related. There are over 20 indigenous languages, different Mayan languages that are still spoken, as the primary language in Guatemala. Unfortunately, those have very little. They've been pushed out of the fertile areas, for farming, which is what they had done over the centuries, and into the areas where you couldn't hardly grow anything, with the wealthier ones, coming in and taking over. And those in Guatemala, as in El Salvador, tend to be the mestizo. They tend to be, those that have some European blood, and had some money kind of going along with it. And this has created a whole lot of unrest. So started out in the 1930s, in El Salvador, but we didn't pay too much attention, because the movement wasn't going anyplace, and we weren't all that concerned about communism. But when World War II ended and Russia started expanding its borders in middle and Eastern Europe, and then indicating its interest to spread communism into the Western Hemisphere, we began to get a little bit worried. We saw it first really crop up in the early 1950s in Guatemala. The indigenous people were starting to uprise against the oligarchy, the wealthy, and things were beginning to get out of control. Typically, your militaries in your Latin American countries are affiliated pretty closely with the wealthy. You tend to see, the wealthy class in the military supporting them, and the have-nots on the other side. But that's not always the case. Sometimes within the military, you get the more liberal, progressive, left-leaning in there. And in Guatemala, a military coup d'etat, a junta, took over with some of these liberal officers, and they started a program of agrarian reform in Guatemala. The rich ones said, "Oh, no! We're not having the military taking away our land and redistributing it. This isn't going to happen." And with the campesinos, the peons starting to gain some power, Marxism was having an opportunity, to come in and take over. And the U.S. government says, this is a situation we don't want to see taking place. We are going to back the powers that be in Guatemala, which turned out to be the wealthy and then the conservative side of the military. So we sent the CIA in, we sent the Army Special Forces, the Green Berets in particular, to train up the Guatemalan Army to help remove the liberal officers in charge of the junta in Guatemala and put the more conservative ones in, and basically squashed that movement of the equalization of the haves and the have-nots in Guatemala. Interestingly, while this was going on, and this is the early 1950s, 1950 to 1954, Che Guevara made his appearance. You guys learn anything about Che? With Miss Saunders, a little bit. Revolutionary hero, tremendously charismatic, guy. The number 2 for Fidel Castro in Cuba. Probably if it had not been for Che Guevara, Fidel Castro would not have overthrown the government, and taken over Cuba. Che, an interesting guy. He's Argentine. Came from an upper middle class family. Argentina, did have middle class, and Che was a physician, was a doctor, but he was one of these guys, who was real liberal in his thinking. His heart was for the poor. He wanted to do everything that he could, to help the poor. Got him into Guatemala. He went in there as a physician, and then also working with the guerrilla forces that were starting to build up. Met Raul Castro, Fidel's younger brother, who is, the current dictator and president of Cuba right now. Well, the government, regained control in Guatemala, and so Che, had his opportunity to meet Fidel, and went into Cuba, and got together with Fidel Castro. And Cuba at this time in the 1950s was going through a similar upheaval. Military dictator, guy by the name of Batista, Fulgencio Batista, had ruled for years and years, ruthless, extremely corrupt, and the campesinos of Cuba decided enough. We're going to rise up, or organize, and see if we can't overthrow the government. And with a whole lot of Che's help, he started out as a combat medic, but he was so sharp, as a military tactician and strategist. He went all the way up to the top and was very instrumental in putting together very effective fighting forces in Cuba. And by 1959, between Fidel Castro and Che Guevara, they overthrew Batista, sent him out of the country, took over Cuba. At that time, Castro considered himself a socialist, not a communist, but the U.S. government was worried about him with his very left leanings, privatizing all of the property, nationalizing the industries. The rich Cubans fled, and they went to Miami, leaving their sugar plantations and everything behind. And Castro then took over. What was significant, it was that Castro was heavily backed by the USSR, by Nikita Khrushchev, who was the president of the time. They provided the arms, for the guerrillas, and then they provided the arms, for the new revolutionary government and military of Fidel Castro. And so this is our stepping stone now to the Western Hemisphere. We've got our foot in the door, to expand. Khrushchev sent missiles, to Cuba. Big time missiles. Sounds a little bit like North Korea, although these weren't nuclear. But Havana is only 90 miles from Miami, Florida, so you don't need those IBM long-range missiles, to hit our cities. And man, we got real concerned about that situation. This is when John F. Kennedy was newly elected president, and we basically said, get those missiles out of Cuba, or we're going to come in and take over the country. And the Russians backed down at the last minute, sent the missiles back to Russia, but left Castro's government in power. So that was kind of the status quo, for a good while. Meanwhile, in Central America, there's problems are cropping up again in El Salvador in particular, and in Nicaragua in particular. Nicaragua, an interesting country, military dictator by the name of Anastasio Somoza. His family had run Nicaragua for decades, from the 1920s up through the 1970s, when Anastasio himself was the military dictator. Extremely corrupt, like Batista, ruled with an iron hand. The Nicaraguan campesinos had absolutely nothing. That very small ruling class had everything. And so a fellow by the name of Daniel Ortega, kind of like a Che Guevara or a Fidel Castro, started organizing and putting together a Marxist uprising, financed and armed by Cuba. Arms going from Russia to Cuba, from Cuba to Nicaragua. Well, at this point in history, we're getting real concerned about what's going on. Ortega had taken over the government, and our president back at that time was Jimmy Carter. Said, well, we need to support this new government, even though it's real left leaning. We need to look after the people of Nicaragua, and we will provide them aid, to get them on their feet. So we had a $60 million aid package, provided, for Nicaragua, until the Carter administration found out that the arms coming into Nicaragua, some were staying, and the others, the Nicaraguans, were sending to El Salvador to arm the new rebel movement in El Salvador that was also communist-backed, Marxist-backed. So we pulled the plug, on the financial assistance, for the Daniel Ortega government in Nicaragua. And we started to build up the El Salvadoran military. We did not want to see the domino effect continue from Cuba to Nicaragua, and then from Nicaragua potentially to El Salvador. then it would have gone to Honduras, the neighbor, and probably on into Guatemala. And then we could see all of that being communist controlled. Mexico was next then, in particular with the upheaval and the same kinds of phenomena going on in Mexico. And so our position was not in our back door. We are not going to allow this to happen, and we are going to draw the line in El Salvador. And so that's the attempt that we made. Backtracking a little bit, so our focus has gone from Cuba to Central America, primarily Nicaragua, our funding of the Contras to try to overthrow Ortega now that he's in place, and now to building up the government in El Salvador. We thought we could probably do it because we did have some success further south in South America, in Chile, of all places. In 1970, the first democratically elected avowed communist president in the Western Hemisphere, Salvador Allende. And oh my God, that was something, that we weren't going to tolerate. We weren't real surprised that it happened, because Che Guevara, after he had done his thing in Cuba and ended up at odds, with Fidel Castro, went to Africa to try to build up the poor in Africa. And from Africa, he went back to Latin America and went into Bolivia and started a guerrilla movement in Bolivia. But by this time, the U.S. was pretty much aware of what he could do, and helped the Bolivian army capture Che Guevara. And Che Guevara was executed very, very soon after he was captured. It's a little bit murky in there exactly what the CIA's role was in that. It is known that one of our CIA operatives was a major player in the capture, and the disposal of Che Guevara. And we probably had some of our Green Berets, involved in that too. So Che was taken care of in 1967, but this idea of the pot starting to boil, not just in Central America, but in South America too, we decided to step in Chile. And it is pretty commonly known that we were very active in trying to keep Allende from getting elected, for trying to undermine him and his campaign, for supporting the opposition, that we were friendly towards, but Allende was elected nevertheless. Another reason for our government being involved is for our own national interests. And our own national interests have typically evolved around economic interests. In Chile, ITNT was the major industry in the country, and it was 80% U.S. owned. In addition, the mining in Chile is huge in mining, the copper mining. The two largest mining companies were U.S. owned, and they represented a major part, of the Chilean economy. Well, we could see, with the Marxist president, those companies were going to be taken away. They would be nationalized, and we would lose all of those interests. Same thing was going on in Central America. A huge company by the name of the United Fruit Company had extensive land holdings throughout Central America, particularly Honduras, Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Guatemala. Those primary countries. And so when the upheaval was going on in the oligarchy with the right-wing side of the militaries, were protecting those interests. Well, we put a whole lot of money in to see to it that would happen. We were going to be willing, to put up with these ruthless, dictators, and this terrible chasm between, who had money and who had not, so that our United Fruit Companies and Anaconda Mines and all, would maintain operating, and we would have our economic interests, looked after. So this was what was going on. Salvador Allende took over, but is often typical with communist governments. They can be real disorganized. The economy can head south real fast, and he was having some real problems. And so he was deposed of. The Chilean military, being very conservative, said, okay, enough's enough. We're taking control of our country again and getting the economy back up and employment back up, and with some help from the U.S. Deposed Allende, and he was killed too. We allowed the Chileans to put their general in by the name of Agustin Pinochet, who was that typical dictator. I mean, he was organized. I mean, he really got the economy going, but he put a lot of the money into his own pocket, but lasted for a number of years until finally the Chileans said, no, we've had enough of this, and voted him out. He took refuge in Spain and did some traveling around. And lo and behold, then after doing away with the communists, doing away with the military dictatorship, having free elections in Chile, it's turned out to be a very strong country. It's kind of centrist in its politics. It's not real right wing, and it's not real left leaning. Got a very strong economy. Is a first world country by all means. And so we're thinking, well, we want to see this happen in Central America too. So now getting back to El Salvador. El Salvador had this left-leaning military junta that the rich people and the right wing in the military said, no, this isn't going to work. And the right wing military in El Salvador was ruthless. They assassinated the bishop of El Salvador. They had death squads that even went after nuns in the Catholic Church, because this was one instance where instead of the church being allied with the military and the rich, that is typical, that's what it was in Spain, the church was the friends of the poor, and that's why the Salvadoran death squads went after the Catholic Church in El Salvador. But it is in all things. It's not always a one-way affair. That the right-wing military death squads, the national police, the Batallón de Atlacat, that was notorious, for the kidnappings and all. Well, the guerrillas, you used the same tactics as well. There were a lot of instances, of the murders of the prominent people, by the guerrillas as well too. What's interesting, the way the news reports, you get all kinds of reporting of the bad military, what they were doing, but you didn't get the other side, with where the guerrillas were doing, pretty much the same thing, and that really is the reality. But the U.S. decided, okay, we can't have the communists take over El Salvador. We don't want the ultra right, to take over either. We're going to back a middle of the road guy. And an engineer by the name of Napoleon Duarte had actually won the Salvadoran elections, and I think that was 78 or 1980 legitimately, but the military said no. You're not going to be the president. We're gonna have the junta rule, and he basically was never able to serve. But we began. We built up our embassy in El Salvador and had a pretty good military presence with the U.S. military group. We would have a fair number of trainers. My Navy guys training the Salvadoran Navy, outfitting them with patrol boats. And our mission, was to intercept arms coming across the Gulf of Fonseca from Nicaragua, into El Salvador, but training the Salvadoran Navy where they could do that. Similar efforts, with the Salvadoran Army and the Salvadoran Air Force. So we would have key military advisors working with those three primary branches, training them, supplying them, and getting them built up. A little help from the U.S. government, from an ex-Marine by the name of Oliver North, who was able to maintain, funds, coming into to the Contras against Nicaragua and into El Salvador, when our government had put some spending limits on, particularly for funding the Contras. So now we're not going to fund them anymore, but we had a deal. We called it Iran Gate, where funds were sent to Iran, and then Iran sent the funds to Nicaragua, to the Contras, kind of through the pipeline in El Salvador to make that happen. But the long and the short is we ended up with a successful policy in El Salvador. We saw to it, that the death squads were done away with, that the real right-wing military officers were not the ones that were going to control the army, but the army was still putting a whole lot of pressure on the guerrillas. During my time there, and this was the late 80s, the guerrilla influence had started to wane because El Salvador was coming up. How much time do we have?
We can go a little bit longer.
A little bit longer. Then. Okay, well, we'll kind of finish this up. We're able to get Napoleon Duarte back in. The guerrilla movement faded away, and El Salvador's turned out to be a democratic nation. Same thing with Nicaragua. We got Ortega to back off and to allow free elections. He was voted out. A lady from the press was voted in. And Nicaragua now is a democratic country. Although Ortega is back in as president, he's no longer communist. He's just socialistic, to a pretty good degree. El Salvador had right-wing presidents, but they were not oppressive. And now the current president of El Salvador is from the old FMLN, which was, the conflux of the left wing and the Marxist political parties. But it's stable. What the problem is, El Salvador has a huge violence problem. El Salvadoran gangs are just completely out of control and run the country. Do not travel to El Salvador, because you do put your life at risk and being kidnapped primarily by the gangs, or if not by the gangs, by the drug elements that have also permeated a whole lot of Central America. The narco-trafficantes, as you're aware, make Mexico a dangerous place these days. Guatemala, Honduras, same thing, but not Nicaragua. Nicaragua, you want to travel to Mexico? It's the safe place to go to. Even safer than Costa Rica, that has always been a haven. Costa Rica never had these problems that I've been talking about because Costa Rica had always balanced to the groups there. Costa Rica is really fairly socialistic, which means medicine and healthcare and education, for everybody. So not all of that unrest. But that's kind of in a nutshell what I've experienced, lived through. Some thoughts that I have on good things that our government has done, bad things that our government has done, and then looking and seeing what we've got left behind. El Salvador, again, a mess. What happened to El Salvador? All the young people were either guerrillas or army. That's all they knew how to do, was to shoot and fire and kill and all. And so they just turned to crime. The gangs were the natural place for them to go. And who knows when that's going to get taken care of. But I think the good news on the other side is we're seeing Cuba becoming, less communistic. We see some stability in most of Latin America. Venezuela certainly has its problems, but for the large part, I think our U.S. foreign policy has been successful despite some serious ups and downs that we've gone through. Okay, just a couple of minutes for questions so I don't make you guys late for class.
Well, they wrote down.
Okay, all right, let's get some. Yeah.
I know a lot of them wanted to know about your training.
Yeah, sure. I am dated. I left the SEAL teams 25 plus years ago. Things have really changed since my time. But what the SEAL teams have always been known for is the very rigorous entry program that's known as BUDS, Basic Underwater Demolition SEAL Training. A six-month program, that weeds out the weak and only leaves the strong behind. The class I went through, we started with 117 people in the class, and these are guys, that could meet all the physical requirements: the running, the swimming, the push-ups, and the pull-ups, and all. And we graduated with 27 in the class. I mean, it is a bear, going without sleep, food, wet, cold, tired, and hungry all the time, pushed to the point where you can't take it anymore, and 75% ringing the bell, saying, nope, this isn't for me, I'm out of there. I was actually too chicken to ring the bell and get out of there. I didn't want to be so embarrassed. I said, no, I can't do this. I remember trying to sprain my ankle running up and down the sand dune so I could slip out gracefully with it. But I got to the point where I could hack it, and enjoyed it, and liked so much being in the underwater demolition teams and SEAL teams that I ended up making the 20-year career. I mean, they're the most motivated, hard-charging guys, that you'll ever run into. My challenge as an officer was reining the guys in, because our guys would be brainwashed. They could do anything and everything. There wasn't anything that couldn't be done. You never leave a man behind, and some things like that. Back in my days, we tended to operate in the shadows. People didn't know what SEALs were about, what they're doing. That has changed now. And our SEAL community has allowed that to happen in order to get more visibility and get more good people in as SEALs, because everybody wants to do that. So instead of us, having to cherry pick from the nuclear Navy and the aviation Navy, now anybody that wants to be a SEAL has an opportunity to go out for it and try. But no, I loved swimming at night underwater with a rebreather, no bubbles, carrying munitions, going underneath the ship and planting the munitions under the ship, so swimming back out again. Oh man, that was my cup of tea. Parachuting, into the ocean, with your rubber inflatable boats and your munitions and weapons and things. Yeah, that was some kind of fun.
I know you told stories about your the drills that you guys had to do underwater and going.
Yeah, one of the parts is what you call drown proofing. I mean, you got to be good in the water, and that's what Wade's causes most people to drop out. Being from Corpus, I was a water person, so I was real comfortable that way. So when we did the drown proofing, which is having your hands tied behind your back and having your feet tied at the ankle, and then thrown in the deep pool, and you have to survive or you're going to drown, I mean, and most people, when they're bound up like that, in the water, I mean, just panic, with it. But there's a technique, where you can get by. You kind of learn to do a little dolphin kick like this, come up, get a breath of air, and then sink back down again. You get this little rhythm going, and it's doable. But a lot of people can't manage that. You've got the instructors, and when a person is just about to panic and drown, well, they come in and keep that from happening. Although we have lost a couple, doing that even still. But it's the kind of thing, it's a confidence builder. You think you can do anything and everything. I remember one other thing underwater. We had to free dive down deep, carrying a weight, putting it below a rope, and then bringing it back up again. And I remember diving down, and getting my weight snagged on the rope. And man, I just was doing everything I could to bring that weight back up. And I completely blew out my sinuses in the process. I came up out of the water, and there was my face mask just full of blood and gook and everything. But the instructors liked it. Oh, this guy's a hacker. He's not going to give up. And so that worked out pretty good for me. Had another guy that free dove down to 100 feet. I mean, free diving 100 feet. Yeah, that's amazing. He didn't make it all the way back up. He passed out about 10 feet before returning to the surface, but fortunately floated back to the top, and we got him aboard the boat, and back in good shape. but you get these guys that do things, push it to the very limit, and sometimes go past the limit. That's a little instance there.
And you told us too. I think you told us about they drop you in the ocean and stuff. You just swimming back.
Well, the SEALs are water oriented, despite Afghanistan. Iraq and Afghanistan got divided up. Basically, the Army Special Ops, had Iraq, and the Navy Special Ops, which are the SEALs, had Afghanistan. There's no water in Afghanistan, but that's part of the military politics. But traditionally, SEALs come in by sea, and our best best source are submarines. And what you would do is you'd go aboard a submarine. Nowadays, they're all nuclear submarines. And you would lock out of the escape tower of the submarine 35 feet below, so the submarine is not exposed. You come up with your rubber boat, your gear, your men, and then you go 50 miles, you traverse, to the beach, and then perform your mission on the beach. You come back out the 50 miles when you're done, and dive back down and go back into the submarine again. And that was the way you could get in and out of places, and nobody would ever know. Of course, the Army Special Forces really didn't do that for those kinds of missions. That was a SEAL thing. But that's interesting too. Going in and out of submarines under the water as well. When we would parachute into the ocean with our inflatable boats, we had all the outboard motors and the gas. It took us a few years to get the parachuting done right, where the parachute would deploy satisfactorily, and so we often called that routine the flaming duck, because 5 times out of 10, the boat would crash, you'd burst into flames, and then you don't have anything to swim to but a burning boat there. But that was another way that that we would come into a country to do whatever needed to be done.
Y'all can ask questions if you want. If they run out, I have.
Okay. Our SEAL community used to be real small. It's grown. Everybody knows everybody, and we kind of had a thing going. If somebody tells you they're a SEAL, they're probably not. That's your number one light bulb going off. The guy says he is. He's not. If that's the case. Yeah.
What kind of uniform did the SEALs have?
Well, my time was when Vietnam was winding down, and we wore the uniform that was typical in Vietnam, that we call them jungle greens. And so it was a drab green, kind of baggy with the pockets and with the jacket. We switched over to camouflage greens after that, and the SEALs had always been allowed some leeway in wearing uniforms. We could wear blue jeans with a camo top, and that would be fine. Our guys could have beards when the other services you couldn't. Nowadays that changed. The Army in Afghanistan, they allow their guys to do the beards as well too. One quick story. Let you go. A couple of friends of mine. We had 3 Medal of Honor winners in Vietnam. I know 2 of them pretty well. One guy rescued a downed Air Force pilot deep into North Vietnamese territory by dressing up as a Viet Cong and going in one of the sampans, going through the jungle, rescuing the guy, getting him out. Just a real brave deal. His leading petty officer, a year later, he was redeployed to Vietnam. They were working with the Vietnamese SEALs. It was 2 of them. This guy's was a Navy lieutenant. Tommy Norris was his name, and his petty officer, a first-class petty officer, Michael Thornton, were doing some recon in North Vietnam, and were compromised. And spotted by a large group of the North Vietnamese, who put them under heavy fire. The lieutenant sent his petty officer with the 2 Vietnamese SEALs, said, "I'm going to cover for you guys. Go back across the sand dunes to the beach while I'm laying down some fire." And so the 3 of them went back, and Mike Thornton, the petty officer, saw that his officer, Tom Norris, was hit. And so he says, "Okay, you guys stay here on the beach. I'm going back and getting my officer." He goes back there, and Norris is hit in the head. He picks him up, kind of pushes, the brains back into his head, puts him over his shoulder across sand dunes, being fired at, gets him to the beach, and then they swim out to a destroyer that's 1,000 yards off the beach, and get into the destroyer. Tommy Norris is saved. He's got a big old dent in his head, and he's got one eye, and has trouble, with keeping the right colored socks on the right feet, but is still a functional guy. It's kind of a typical SEAL thing. You never leave a guy behind, a big, strong, strapping guy to be able to throw an officer over his shoulder and go up and down sand and get him out to the sea. Yeah, it works. I'm hoping to get him to Steve Mill sometime. I'm with the American Legion post here, and I'm gonna try to get Mike Thornton to come out, and talk to the Legionnaires about his experiences in Vietnam. Okay, all right.
So they're kind of wanting to know, like, what did you do when you were off?
Oh
When you were
gosh.
off duty?
Well, okay. Well, in El Salvador, I got to know the Salvadoran military. Uh, I like horses. I've always had horses, ridden horses, and I got to meet up with the Salvadoran cavalry, where they still have a horse cavalry, and got to ride with them and learn to jump. Which is a real neat experience. Kind of. Like your jumpers here that you see in the east coast of the U.S. Also met an architect in El Salvador that designed houses that he built on the cliffs overlooking the Pacific Ocean for the rich people. He was a big time hunter and a dove hunter and an Olympic skeet shooter, and so we hunted white-winged doves with him, and we'd go early in the morning out to the cliffs, at sunrise, and instead of having bird dogs, you'd have bird boys. And those guys would be able to pick out the white-winged dove coming from just eons away, way before you could see them. Spot them for you. You'd shoot them, and they'd go and fetch the doves as well. And when the dove hunting was over, about 9 o'clock in the morning, then we'd go to one of these houses that the architect had built, and the one that we would go to built a swimming pool kind of in the side of the cliff, where the waves would splash into the pool and go back out again. And so we would have a few beers there, and some of the fishermen, the guys, in the little boats would come and bring raw oysters, and we'd just, drink beer and eat raw oysters, getting ready to come back to the capital. Got into big trouble one time when I didn't have radio communication, with the commander of the military. Where the heck have you guys been? We've been trying to reach you. You didn't clear going out there to do this dove hunting, whatever. So I got a bit of a chewing on that, but it turned out okay. But it was nice. I had. We had a house cleaner and a cook, and we had a gardener, and had the house guard and the bodyguard. My bodyguard was able to get him to the U.S. under a legal visa. He lives in Corpus Christi now and has a successful landscaping company. Yes, Salvadorans are some kind of hard workers. He made his money tunneling under the houses in Corpus, where the plumbers wouldn't go for the shifting, sediment and all doing the plumbing. Well, shoot, he would do that and made a lot of money in the process. When I went to pick him up, he came to Nuevo Laredo, and I was doing a little ranching in South Texas at the time, and so I went across the border, to pick him up. I had my handgun with me in my pickup truck, and I drove across into Mexico. And, oh damn! I've got a big time problem here. I've got my nice Sig Sauer, 9mm, worth about $700. I guess I'm gonna have to toss the thing into the Rio Grande before I get caught, and get thrown into jail. I said, man, I don't want to do that. I thought, well, I know the consulate there in Nuevo Laredo. He was with the State Department in El Salvador when I was there. So I go over to the U.S. consulate in Nuevo Laredo, say, Ron, I got a problem. I've got my 9mm. I didn't mean to bring it. Yeah, that's not a problem. We'll put it in the diplomatic pouch, and I'll send it across the border. And you go over there to customs, and they'll have it sitting there waiting for you. So it was able to do that. Yeah. So yeah, I said knowing people and some military connections and all. Yeah.
What kind of weapons did you use, like, in battle?
Well, what we carried with us, was 9mm handgun. The classic M16 was the main armament. Although we moved over, to Heckler and Koch, not 9mm submachine gun tended to be a real favored, weapon that we had. We like the Sig Sauer as opposed to the Beretta that was the official handgun for the military, but the SEALs were able to use the ones that they wanted. So typically, depending on what the mission was, the H and K Oh, I can't remember, Mark 5 or whatever its designation was. But depending on the mission too, sniping became a big deal for a lot of the missions, and so often you'd have your sniper that back in those days was a 55, it was a 50 caliber, rifle, single shot, bolt action, was fairly common. M60 machine gun, was a stalwart. We also used a grenade launcher, and the M79 grenade launcher or the M16 that had a grenade launcher, with it as well. That was the main stuff. Demolitions always had a role for demolitions to carry them.
Sweet.
Yeah.
You said you were stationed in the Philippines
Yeah.
as well as El Salvador.
Uh-huh.
Did you live anywhere else?
Well, my time was either on the West Coast in San Diego with the West Coast teams, or the East Coast in Virginia Beach next to Norfolk, with the East Coast SEAL teams, where I was with SEAL Team 4, and then would deploy from those bases. So I did my 3-year tour in the Philippines, where we had a forward operating base where we would deploy SEAL platoons out there and then send them to wherever the hot spots were. So while I was in the Philippines, I got to do a lot of traveling. Korea and Australia and Thailand and Singapore, Okinawa. So really got real comfortable with that area. When I was at SEAL Team 4, it was Peru and Puerto Rico and Honduras and Guatemala and Panama. A lot of time in Panama and El Salvador, as well. Mm-hmm.
Have you picked up any other languages besides Spanish?
Well, I started with French, and in fact, I went to the Defense Language Institute French program in Monterey, California, looking to go to Cambodia back when Vietnam and Cambodia were winding down. So I got fairly fluent in French. But we pulled out of Cambodia just when I would have gotten orders to go there, so I was never able to use that. When I got to my orders to go to El Salvador, I made a deal with my officer assignment detailer. Said, okay, I need to get my Spanish brushed up on. I need more than the get by that I've been using. I need to be fairly fluent. Said, I don't want to go to the Defense Language Institute in Monterey. I want to go to the Foreign Service Institute in Washington, D.C., where they train the diplomats, which is a much better program. And the way it is, they've got anywhere from 3 to 5 people per class, per teacher. Your teacher is a native speaker, 6 hours a day. It's from 8 to 3 o'clock. 5 days a week, and then lots of studying. At night. And so typically, in 6 months' time, you develop a very good working use of the language, which has the diplomats ready to go in and be able to do their job reasonably well. And I got a head start since I knew Spanish. I was able to whip through the program in about 2.5 months. But when I got to El Salvador too, at lunchtimes, I hired one of the embassy Salvadorans to give me Spanish lessons, and she and I would sit and talk and practice Spanish to really develop my fluency even more than I arrived in the country. Yeah.
How'd you feel when the war in El Salvador was over?
Well, but kind of, I was relieved. I left in November of '89. 2 weeks after I left, the guerrillas made their last big push and pushed into the city. And my house being on the outskirts, the house took a mortar round through the ceiling, blew up in the living room. We had left two weeks prior to that, but did a number on the house. The house next door belonged to the ambassador of the Dominican Republic. He had the national police, where his house guards protecting. The guerrillas came up. The national police took off their uniforms, put on their civilian clothes, and slipped out the back way. And so the Dominican ambassador holed up in the safe room, which is typically a bathroom, with metal doors, and radio, and food and water. Was holed up on there for hours until the Salvadoran military could come and rescue him. And that then was the highlight. When that failed, well, then the movement really was coming to an end. They lost support from the populace. The populace could see that they were doing as bad stuff as the military was, and that they did not feel that the Marxist movement was going to improve lives for them, and so they just ended up fading away pretty basically. Anybody else? Okay.
I have a lot here. So, how was it easy for you and your family to assimilate to the Salvadorian lifestyle?
Yes, and it's not easy for everybody. It takes a certain personality to, to be adaptive, to new things and different things. And when I was at the military group, we'd get some people coming in that didn't belong, that were not adapting, that we would have to send back out. We had an army sergeant there, just had a chip on his shoulder. He came back to the embassy one time bragging about picking up one of the, a military guy coming into the civilian airport and said, there was some so-and-so parked in front of me and, in a non-darn parking place. So I just used my Suburban and I just, put it into gear and just pushed him out of the way. And I could hear the gears just grinding on that vehicle. I really taught him a lesson, man. You talk about ugly American, that's about as ugly as it gets. But that was his attitude. He said, I'm superior to these guys, and I'm the big shot around here. So yeah, you do run into that, but you try to screen those guys out. I was fortunate with my Navy guys. I didn't have a single one, that wasn't able to hack it. But at the same time, we try to pick those guys that had the language, the sensitivity to the culture, and are flexible dealing with different times. My three kids, they're pretty laid back, and they did great, and they remain very connected to Hispanic culture. My daughter was telling me she had sat on a plane with a Honduran refugee who had just came in, didn't speak any English at all, was going to Washington, D.C., didn't understand what the stewardess, flight attendant was saying, and she said she just really connected with that young lady, and now is a friend, and stays in touch with her in Washington, D.C. Helped her get together with the relative that she was supposed to meet at the airport. This young lady never been on a plane before, and she was just completely blown away with, Washington, D.C. and all of that.
Did you ever face any injuries?
No, I never did. I have a knee replacement. I got my knee replaced that the orthopedic surgeon said, I think you probably did that from all that parachute jumping, that you did. I thought it was from playing badminton at Tarleton. But he put that on his diagnosis, and so that got me a little bit of disability payment because of the military connection, with the worn out knee. I remember one time I thought I broke my tailbone parachuting. I was going out of the back of a helicopter and slipped on the oily deck and just landed like that, and man, yeah, man. But it turned out to be just a bad bruise. But any of you guys that are thinking military kind of like that stuff like that. Not just the diving at night, but parachuting at night is a real neat experience too. My first parachute jump, was in San Diego, in our parachute landing fields right on the border with Mexico, and we got put out. They didn't have the wind calculated, and we ended up landing in the tomato fields next to Tijuana. That's my first tactical jump. I was first one out of the helicopter, and here we are, with the tomato plants, all over it.
On that note, I know there were some of them that were interested in military service. If you guys would like to talk a little bit more, you can up here. And
Sure.
we still have a few minutes for the bell, so you guys can just hang out if you Thank Mr. Smith for talking to you.
My pleasure. Say something. Yeah, say something. Yeah, well, the Marines are interesting. They have not had an official special operation group. They have just instituted it now. So now, there is that field available in the Marine Corps, like the Green Wave, Special Forces Army, and So that's our Marine Corps knows the basic training is being real rigorous. It's turning a boy into a man. So it's a lot of in your face, kind of demeaning you and pushing you to physical violence. So they're pretty good watch. It's nothing like we had special operations. It really changes the guy's life. I know a lot of Marines that tell me, so man, when they went in, they were just a child and had basic training. They were a man.
How are they mentally prepared?
Well, what they do is by getting in your face, giving you, the skills to be able to handle it, or keep your cool, not lose it. And they will kind of get you aside and give you a little bit of guidance. This is what worked for me when I was going through boot camp. This is what you need to do. So you do get a little bit of that.
And I'm planning to go here my 2018 college. I'm in the Marines home. What kind of program is that where I go through to get the military pay right now?
You have to keep versions of what's the GI. So anybody that serves honorably, has tuition assistance. These programs are federal programs. They're well known in the military. They're educational counselors, that can get you started while you're still in, or prepare you when you're getting ready.
And they only do public university programs, right?
No, you can apply tuition assistance to private ones as well too.
Well, with my situation right now, I'm in foster care, and I would take classes called paper. They also help pay for my college, all that kind of stuff.
Where do these chairs go?
I know what